Asomento Kiriu and Soxos Ra Izuxalasti Anentunies Uranu and Axi Tun Paraklitun Tu Abnif Matisali Tias Amin Alleluia. Let's talk about saints. So, what exactly is a saint? I mean, how do you define what a saint is? Well, a saint is essentially someone who is recognized, usually through canonization, as being preeminent in holiness. The most commonly known traditions that recognize sainthood include the Eastern and Oriental Orthodox Christian traditions, the Roman Catholic Church, the Lutheran Church, and the Anglican Church, among others. Now, saints can come in two main forms. You have celestial beings such as archangels like Saint Michael, or humans like Saint Peter, the rock upon which Christ built his church. Now, before we go any further, there is an elephant that we do need to address that is in the room. And the question is whether or not the saints in the traditions where they are recognized are worshipped or venerated. In Christian traditions, where saints are venerated, it is important to remember that this is not a worship of those saints. Instead, their lives and their stories are memorialized and held up as examples as to what it means to truly walk with Christ. And so when the saints are invoked in prayers of intercession, this is not a worship of those saints, but instead a request for those saints to add their prayers to our own so that God may hear us better and show us the way to build a better relationship with him. We also have to remember that the lives of many of the saints started off in a way that we would not necessarily consider very Christian. Consider St. Paul, who was Saul of Tarsus, who dedicated his life, at least until he saw a vision of Jesus Christ, to the persecution of the early Christians. He had one singular goal: to stamp out the message of Jesus Christ until the Lord revealed himself to him. And then he became one of the greatest thinkers and leaders of the early church. And there are so many stories that we can go into, but we're here to talk about Africa, aren't we? So let's talk about the tradition of sainthood in Africa. There are over 70 well-known saints whose origins are in Africa. We can start with examples like Saint Anthony, who was the founder of the monastic tradition, starting in Egypt. There is Saint Monica of Africa, who is the mother of Saint Augustine of Hippo. Then, of course, there's Saint Victor I, who was the Bishop of Rome and the first African Pope of the Roman Church. Then you have the twin brothers Ezana and Sazan. Saint Ezana was the first Christian king of Ethiopia, and his brother Sazan was largely responsible for not just helping to establish the faith in Ethiopia, but also defending it against beliefs like the Arian heresy. But today's story isn't about them. I would like to talk to you about a saint whose life was marked with redemption, sacrifice, and service. A man who turned his life completely around and rose from being a slave to one of the greatest fathers of the early church. Today, we're going to talk about Saint Moses the Strong. So, who is Saint Moses the Strong? Saint Moses the Strong is recognized in the Roman Catholic Church, the Eastern Orthodox Church, and the Oriental Orthodox Church. Saint Moses the Strong was one of the Desert Fathers, meaning that he was one of the early thought leaders during the foundational years of what we now know as Christian asceticism. This is, of course, the practice of living in isolation in a monastery or a nunnery and practicing a life of fasting, prayer, and service. Two of the historical documents that will serve as the sources for the material in this episode will come from the 5th century Palestinian author Sozomen's book, The Ecclesiastical Histories, as well as Bishop Palladis's book, An Ode to the Lives of the Holy Fathers. Here are some interesting facts about Saint Moses the Strong. Firstly, his name Moses is Egyptian, meaning son of the water. You'll recognize that from a certain famous person in Exodus. Secondly, he went by 5 different honorifics. The first would be St. Moses the Strong, and this was in reference to not just his size and stature, but also to his will and his discipline. Secondly, he was known as St. Moses the Robber, and this was a reference to the life that he lived prior to becoming a monk. The third and fourth would be St. Moses the Ethiopian or St. Moses the Abyssinian. Both of these are in references to what is believed to be his heritage, which is in modern-day Ethiopia. And the fifth and final is St. Moses the Black, and this is a reference to his skin color. The world in the time of St. Moses the Strong was changing. Christianity had just become a decriminalized religion, so now people were free to worship Jesus Christ as they chose and no longer had to hide in catacombs. There was an explosion of thought. Different thinkers would come up with different ideas. You had questions about the Arian heresy, monophysitism versus myophysitism, the Council of Nicaea, the Council of Chalcedon, and all of these amazing events were taking place. But at this time, St. Moses was nowhere near any of this. In fact, his story begins as a slave in the house of a Roman official. Now, he was a bit of a rebellious child, and he was, shall we say, very difficult to control. And for that reason, the man who owned him set him free. Moses?
Yeah?
I am tired of you stealing things. You are a rotten child. I'm going to send you out into the streets now.
Oh no, you're giving me my freedom.
No, don't argue. You can't stay here. You need to go.
I am so scared.
Good. Bye.
Okay. Bye.
Wait. Where's my coin purse? Moses! Now at this time, Moses was a young child. He couldn't read, he couldn't write, and he had no connections to speak of. No gold, no land, no wealth. And so he turned to the only thing he knew how to do well, and that was steal. And through the years, he lived a very hard life, stealing, robbing, murdering, and fighting in the streets. In fact, he had become so efficient and so dangerous that he led a band of 75 men. And the story of his life is often marked with the fact that he was large, powerful, and imposing. This life of crime, debauchery, and danger acquitted him very well. He grew a grand reputation for being a dangerous robber, well known to the authorities, and feared by many of the people who lived around him. Truly, he was a man who lived by the sword. Do you see this? Yes, I live by this. I can see that you do. Do you want to die by it? I do not. Please, have my money. So what changed? What took him from being a wolf among men into a member of God's flock? Well, there are 3 different accounts as to what led him to change his life. All of them start with an attack on a shepherd. One day, Moses was attempting to rob a very wealthy man, and he was thwarted by the act of a brave shepherd and his dogs. So incensed was Moses at this indignation, this lack of recognition for the danger that he posed, that he had to get revenge and set him right to restore his reputation. So, over the cover of night, he put a sword in his teeth and he swam across a river, looking to take revenge and the life of that shepherd. Now the shepherd saw Moses coming, and he had nowhere to hide but in the sand. So he buried himself, hoping that Moses wouldn't see him. And Moses, going around looking to seek revenge upon this man, could not find him. And so, instead, he took revenge upon the shepherd's flock and slaughtered many of his sheep, eating some of the meat and taking the skins to sell for gold and wine. Now, this is where the story diverges. Now, there are 3 competing stories around the moment of redemption for Moses. The first of them being that he felt so guilty about what he had done to that shepherd that he ended up turning himself in the monastery. The second is that he was reported to the authorities by that shepherd, and being pursued by them, he found the monastery and turned himself in. The third is that he was appealing to his deity at the time, which was the sun. He was a sun worshiper, and he asked the sun to prove that this is the real God, if that is the case. And instead, he was greeted by a voice from heaven that told him to go to the monastery at Scetis. Regardless of what you believe happened, the end of all three is the same. He went to the gates of the monastery, relinquished his sword, and begged the monks to take him in. To Moses' good fortune, he found himself at the gates of the monastery at Scetis. This monastery was founded by Saint Macarius himself, who was the monk that greeted him. Saint Macarius, along with Saint Anthony, is one of the founders of the practice of monasticism. And he was welcomed immediately, embraced as a brother. He worked, prayed, and fasted alongside the brothers in that monastery. And in that time, Moses was given the opportunity to confront himself with the terrible things that he had done during his life of sin. There were many sleepless nights, nightmares, and tears. In fact, on the day that he was baptized, he was so repentant as he gave his confession to Saint Isidore that Saint Macarius had a vision of a tablet being wiped clean by the hand of an angel as Moses went in and was baptized. And out of that water was no longer Moses the robber, Moses the thief, or Moses the murderer. Instead, arose from that water Saint Moses the Strong. The deeds of Saint Moses the Strong are many, great and small, to demonstrate the many things that a normal person can do to build a relationship with God. He did things as small as making sure that the water jugs of his brothers in the monastery were always filled to the brim every morning. He did things as great as traveling miles out into the desert to visit the hermits, to make sure that they had food and water, and to make sure that they didn't need help or that they weren't sick, so that they could continue their lives of prayer and contemplation. He prayed upwards of 50 times a day, but he also made sure not to eat too much rich food, usually eating only a dry piece of bread and drinking water, so that he wouldn't be distracted by the pleasures of the world while he continued to build his connection with God. And even though he was busy praying and fasting, he never found himself too busy to help somebody in need. In fact, one night, there's a story about 4 robbers who broke into the monastery and attacked him while he slept. They seem to have forgotten who they were dealing with. You seem to have forgotten who you're dealing with. Now, the story goes that not only did he defeat the 4 robbers who tried to attack him, but he also tied them up and dragged them to the abbot. And he had been so convincing in his argument, persuasive I might argue, that those 4 men ended up becoming monks themselves. You're lucky I'm not a violent man anymore. Being a wise man, especially in his old age after he'd become ordained as a priest, he left a lot of nuggets of wisdom for us to think about and follow, many of them concerning the way that we see our faith and the way that we practice it, understanding that being a Christian is a very personal journey. Some great gems of his include things like, when someone is occupied with his own faults, he does not see those of his neighbor. Or, you should not have trust in the world lest your trust in God is weakened. And probably one of my favorites, do not agree with he who slanders. Do not rejoice in his slander, and do not hate him who slanders. Now, Saint Moses lived to the ripe old age of 75. And at that time, he had become the leader of the monastery. Now, the way that he ended his life, he believed, was apropos of how he lived it. See, one night, a band of robbers, too many to fend off, had attacked the monastery. And so, in order to protect his brothers, he sent them all away, and he and 6 others decided to occupy the thieves. And when the brothers asked him and said to him, Moses, why will you stay? You're an old man. You can't fend off these men. He looked at them, and he said, he who lives by the sword shall die by it also, as our Lord Jesus said. And so, at the age of 75, accompanied by 6 monks, St. Moses the Strong sacrificed his life under the sword of those bandits to protect the lives of his brothers. His legacy has lasted for centuries. His wisdom follows us as we all consider his story, which shows us that the very worst of us can become the very best. The last can become the first. It shows us that redemption is possible. His relics are venerated in churches around the world, but more importantly, his story tells us that we can be better. All we need is faith. And this, my friends, is the legacy of St. Moses the Strong.
Amen. Hallelujah.